Welcome, friends. My name is Susan Davidson. I'm the Weiss Professor of Computer and Information Science at the University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering and Applied Science. I'm your host of Penn Engineers' Innovation and Impact podcast. Our podcast shares insights from some of the leading experts from around the world who are Penn and Penn Engineering faculty and researchers who are bringing to you the latest breakthroughs and innovations in science, technology, and medicine. Today, we're going to talk about responsible innovation in the first of a three-part series. I'm joined in the studio by three Penn Engineering faculty who are thought leaders in this topic.
Great. So I wanted to start this podcast by asking, what does responsible innovation mean to each of you? Who wants to start? Michael?
Sure. I'll start that way. I don't have to say something different than everybody that follows. Well, I guess to me, I mean, first of all, as a researcher, there's a technical aspect to it. So I'm a machine learning AI researcher, and obviously there have been a lot of ethical, societal concerns around that technology in the last decade or so. And so there is now a very large scientific community that tries to study mitigations for things like demographic bias in trained models or privacy leaks. But I think another big component of it is involving much broader communities than just the technology and scientific communities. So in particular, for better or worse, we're finding ourselves in an environment where I think it's inevitable that strong regulations around technology, and in particular AI and machine learning, are coming. And, you know, whatever one feels about particular pieces of regulation or legislation, I think the good thing about this is it's involving a completely different community of stakeholders who looks at things in a different way than the tech community tends to. Computer science as a field in particular is sort of notorious for building stuff because it's possible and fun and then worrying about the consequences later. And so I think it's been very healthy to have people from public policy and legal and regulatory circles trying to understand the technology, first of all, from their own perspective, and then weighing in on what we should be doing with it or not doing with it as a society.
Right. So I think a diversity of opinions in this area is super important. How about you?
Yeah, well, for a long time in my career, I was doing what I helped was extremely fundamental work. It was not going to be directly useful, I thought, in my career. And so in that realm of my research life, it was let's balance curiosity with ethical thinking. And so there were perhaps particular lines of research that seemed very, very attractive, but I stepped into them and would think, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't go down this path. It dawned on me maybe a decade ago, maybe a little bit even longer than that, but only recently it became clear to me that the things that we were doing actually, to my surprise, were getting out of the laboratory. And at that point, it became incumbent upon us to think about instilling in the students in my laboratory, even classes, but particularly in my laboratory, instilling a sensitivity to how unpredictable the social implications would be of the work that we were doing on the one hand, and then more obviously when talking to my students who had begun to spin out companies, echoing what both Michael and Mark have said, you'd like to make sure that the spin out has value, sure, but you'd also like to make sure that the social implications and the social costs don't outweigh those benefits. And there are many studies of, for example, cryptocurrencies that suggest that. There was one study that showed that for every $1 Bitcoin mined, the costs would be between 40% and 95% of the value of that Bitcoin, depending on the volatility of the Bitcoin. So yes, it's obviously a very valuable enterprise, but it's not clear that the social costs make the economic value at all worthwhile. So trying to instill that in the students became a very important part of the laboratory work at that point.
I remember back in the early days of the Human Genome Project, which I was involved in, there was also, to your point, Michael, it was a community of people from different perspectives who came in. They had social scientists, they had ethicists, they had public policy, statisticians, computer scientists. And it was this diversity, I think, that really helped pave the way. So I'm glad to see that now in computer science, we're finally following in those types of footsteps and trends. But Dan, back to your point about instilling these values of students in the classroom, responsible innovation is something that Penn Engineering has been doing since its inception. And it's something we do try to instill in our students. Why is it that responsible innovation is becoming so important today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two allied components to this. On the one hand, technology is inexorably becoming both more complicated and more pervasive in everyday life. It used to, 150 years ago, you would maybe walk into the factory and sit by your spinning jenny for a few hours, put your dues in, and then you'd go home. And of course, these days, most people walk around with their cell phones in their pockets, their smartphones. They go to bed and read the newspaper with their smartphones. And so the combination of the complexity and the inexorable pervasiveness of the technology in people's lives is making this ever more urgent. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, coming back to the unpredictability, the difficulty of understanding society. Society is very, very complicated, and so we have these ideas about technologies and we put them out, but we often don't think. It's very, very hard for us, I think, to think through what the implications will be, and getting a lead on that seems increasingly important for this combination of reasons. So I think the urgency was always there, but it's become compelling in the last decade, 2 decades.
Right. So, Mark, there are societal and technological changes that are driving this focus. How are we preparing our students to tackle these challenges today and in the future? And for instance, can you tell us about the Penn Community for Collaboratory for Co-Creation? Boy, that's a mouthful. Also known as Penn 4C, which brings together Penn Nursing and Penn Engineering. What issues will that initiative lead students to address?
So I think the interesting thing about Penn 4C, it's kind of, and when we think about responsible innovation, it's coming out responsible innovation in a slightly different way than we might often think about innovation. A lot of times when we talk about innovation, we're talking about, when we talk about value for innovation, it's with respect to products. And there is a monetary, why do people do innovation for products? You want to make money. But there's a different aspect to responsible innovation, which is how do you get people to do innovation that is useful, but has no money value in it. So good things for society that doesn't give you profit. That's an important thing to do. So Penn 4C kind of pushes in that direction. It kind of came about from when COVID, just after COVID, we realized that there are these communities that are at risk. It became very apparent that they were suffering more from COVID. And then if you look at climate change, the same thing is happening with climate change. Whenever there's a tornado or a flood or whatever, the societies that are lower income or often communities of color, they are their houses are damaged more, or they're more at risk. So how can we help that situation? So Penn 4C is trying to address these problems technologically. Are there technological solutions to health issues for communities at risk? So it's a partnership between the community first, ideally, and then engineering and nursing. And that's actually one of the things we try to do is come up with solutions that help the community that we are able to do from a research technology point of view, but that is actually valuable to the community. Many times when we do stuff at Penn as a university for the community, it's with Penn's agenda as number one. And often the community doesn't get as much value as they could. So we're trying to really push the responsible part, the community part, in what we do by having the equal partnership between the three, and ideally driven by the community.
That sounds great. Can you give me a few examples of some of the projects that you've done?
Yeah. So one project is for addressing heat islands. Heat islands are an interesting thing where they've noticed that inner cities typically get much hotter during the summer, and people don't have air conditioning, or there's not as many trees, or they have blacktops and things like that, so it just gets hotter. And there's a correlation between health issues, people get more sick, and there's a correlation with crime and violence in heat islands, which is kind of a weird thing. So we worked with a community called North 10 in the Hunting Park, East Tioga area of Philadelphia, where students developed essentially a solar-powered bus stop for cooling. It has radiative cooling. This is with the Weitzman School of Design professors that we deployed, and then we're able to talk to the community members to see how effective it was and all that type of stuff. So that's one example. We have another project that is addressing youth mental health issues when they're under stress by using AI-generated art. So they create art in collaboration with AI tools. We have a thing we call a smoothie bike project, where there's with high school and the Netter Center, where we go to the high school and essentially they build a bicycle that drives a blender to make smoothies. And then we give we give them also information about health and how do you eat healthy and all that kind of stuff. And we've got a bunch of projects like that.
That sounds really exciting. How do you come up with these ideas?
So this was actually the hardest part. We at first tried to solicit, we told people you can get money, here's some money if you can do these things between these three communities. And at first we were trying to get engineers in the engineering school to work with nursing professors, ideally during the research, and we couldn't. I mean, it was very rare. It was hard to get people to come up with ideas that would actually be useful for the community. So then we went to the community and said, what problems do you have? We will hook you up with engineering professors and nursing professors and get them all together to address their problems. And that started to work a little bit more. So now we're still getting our footing on how do we get those ideas, and it's actually like beating the bushes. It's really hard.
It sounds super exciting. Thank you for your work on this, and I really wish that we have lots of good innovations getting pushed out to the community. It's wonderful. So innovation and ethics are often hard to balance. Michael, your book, The Ethical Algorithm, focuses precisely on that challenge. How does Penn Engineering prepare its students to answer these tough questions?
Yeah, so first of all, The Ethical Algorithm was a book I wrote a few years ago with my faculty colleague and friend Aaron Roth, and it was basically an attempt to survey for a lay reader the kind of scientific agenda I described before within the AI, machine learning, and computer science community more generally, about how to scientifically address issues like fairness and privacy in trained machine learning models. And one of the interesting things about that area that we try to emphasize in the book is that, there are trade-offs involved, right? So in general, making sure that your model is fair by some statistical demographic definition will come at the cost of some amount of predictive accuracy. And then the question is how much in what application domain. And similarly, providing strong privacy guarantees usually comes at some cost of accuracy. And so in recent years, I basically have developed a course called Ethical Algorithm Design. I kind of piloted it as a course for a while, and now it's a formal course meeting various engineering ethics requirements. Yeah, and it's a very popular class, I think, primarily because it's the combination of machine learning and AI and satisfying a requirement. Turns out to be a sweet spot. But in this class, of course, the students, they're Penn students. Many of them are from quantitative majors. And so it's possible to, teach them this material in much, much greater depth and to take them much closer to the frontiers of the area, which include areas like large language models and generative AI. And, one thing that was interesting about writing that book and seeing developments in the field since then is, in some ways, our timing on the book was supreme, and in some ways it was terrible. It was was good timing in that it was a very early book talking about ethical issues in machine learning, but not from there have been several books before that had identified the problems. But when it got around to talking about solutions, it would mainly say, well, we need better laws and regulations, and we agree with that. But one of the points the book tries to make that I try to emphasize in the class is that, as scientists, engineers, and innovators, we could design things differently in the first place rather than, waiting for harms to happen and then litigating them in courts, for example. And so we talk about that, and we talk about what that looks like in the case of large language models. And I think, in addition to them taking away a lot of very, very concrete technical ways of thinking about these problems from a scientific standpoint, I think the other thing I try to emphasize to them that is even more, I think, of a concern than it was when we wrote the book is that it can be very, very hard to draw lines of responsibility in kind of the modern AI, ML industry. So in particular, even before generative AI, if a commercial machine learning developer is providing a face recognition system, there might be certain operating conditions under which they're imagining that system would be used and that they would test it for. And that might not include, for instance, grainy surveillance frames from videos. And so you have this problem that you build something, but what you built is not the final technology. There's going to be a downstream customer or user of it. And of course, this is very, very true in large language models, right? We have these incredibly rich things like ChatGPT. And on the one hand, it's the very open-endedness and generality of these models that make them appealing and powerful for many cases. But it's that same generality that leads to, when people don't like, when they like what it does, it's like, oh, look how creative and clever that was. When they don't like it, it's a hallucination, for instance, or it's toxic. And it's very, very hard to draw kind of general boundaries of this kind around who's responsible for what. What is the responsibility of the developer? What is the responsibility of downstream users or customers of that technology? And I think that this is an area where legal and regulatory circles are really struggling. And it's understandable that they're struggling because it's very hard from outside the industry and really knowing how things are factored and how they're built to sort of clearly say, well, this is where the upstream machine learning developer's responsibility ends, and the company that's going to adapt that system for use on their own data and with their own customers begins. And so you tend to see legislation these days that's sort of a very, very blunt instrument and sort of tries to take whatever party is the most upstream or is the largest or most visible and sort of put it all on them. And so it's not a law class, but I do try to teach the students that it's important to think about these things, even though there may not be answers to them the way there are answers to other things in the class, like how do you train a model to avoid statistical demographic bias.
This is a great course. Out of curiosity, how many students do you have coming from the School of Public Policy or from the law school?
A smattering, I would say, at this point. So a lot of it is, computer science, and now, of course, our AI majors. But I would say that there's a solid third of students that are from, other quantitative majors, but not, sort of the tech majors specifically. So there's a lot of econ majors in it. You see a lot of math and other science majors. I think this is a matter of time, though, because, the prerequisites for the class, I don't think preclude bright law students from showing up. I mean, I actually have had students from the design school before. And so I think it's just a matter of, time. And, of course, the fact it's hard because the class is oversubscribed because of the aforementioned properties. And, things are kind of determined by the size of the room. So a lot of people get left on the waiting list. But I'm hopeful over time that the audience will broaden to include those kinds of people.
It would be super interesting to have project groups that are formed by a technologist as well as a public policy, legal. So I hope that as all of us wish we could
I'll put it on my list.
Insert many different students or allow many different students into our classes. I understand the predicament, but it's terrific. And as the director of the data science program, I'm deeply grateful to you for offering this course, which is super important. So Marie Curie pioneered research in radioactivity, winning the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 and in Chemistry in 1911. Without this work, we wouldn't have nuclear medicine, portable X-ray machines, or many other innovations. However, her contributions to the study of radium and radiation were also instrumental to the future development of the atomic bomb. So, to you as a panel, how can we guard against new technologies being used in harmful ways? And how are Penn and Penn Engineering addressing this challenge by applying responsible innovation in the classrooms and in the labs?
Well, let me go beyond that, if you don't mind, and come back to some of the points that Michael made in the beginning. Even beyond the classroom and the laboratories, we have responsibilities in the larger society. And I think I'm not the only one who's been surprised at how quickly the robots that we are working on have become useful, and they've become useful to a large spectrum of potential users, including the military. So GRASP Lab in particular has been very active, proactive in leading seminars, conferences, private meetings of industry to try to establish best practices, groups that involve government and industry and ethical scholars and legal scholars. So we in GRASP have been trying to be, over the last 5 years, I would say, quite active in helping develop, yes, there are technical issues of provenance, as Michael has said, very, very complicated. At what point does the algorithm or the control law that I invented in my laboratory, at what point am I responsible? What's the provenance? What's the line of provenance? All those issues are very, very important in academia and beyond. But industry is also very much caught up in the question of, we see these horrifying videos from the war in Ukraine where people are chasing around with drones behind them. And the question arises, what are the industrial best practices to make sure that weaponization happens? If it's going to happen, it should happen in the national militaries. It shouldn't happen outside. And particularly how to protect the civilian sphere from the weaponized robots has become very, very important and complicated. So the answer, I think part of the answer is we can't just stay in the classroom and in the laboratory. We actually have to get out there into the community, into the world, and stakeholders, and try to help sort out the many complicated issues that arise with our wonderful and exciting technologies.
And one of the things that, with respect to students, that I think is kind of interesting. So Dan, led this whole effort on lethal autonomous weapons systems workshops, getting all these people together. But one of the things we saw from the students' point of view is that the students were very active and participatory in this whole thing.
Thirsty for us to engage with them and with society in these issues. Yeah.
And I think when we think about responsible innovation, from a student's point of view in the classroom, from what I've seen, the students, it's their future. Future technology is something that they have to worry about. And so they are all very aware of this, and they really want to get into it. So I don't think, to some extent, we just need to kind of maybe give them an organization or support them to help them do what they want to do, which is do this responsible innovation. And, I'm not sure exactly what the best way to do that is, but if we can provide those types of infrastructure, that might be one way.
So tell me more about this workshop, Dan. Who was it for? And
we've had a sequence of workshops. There was a town hall, a particularly active town hall that GRASP ran 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, wherein a variety of different faculty, not just from Penn, particularly from Penn, but from some allied institutions, discussed their own relationship to this issue of weaponization. It's not a simple matter because, for example, in my own research, if you count the number of grants that I've led, the majority have come from the National Science Foundation. But if you look at the dollar input into my laboratory, probably 85% of the dollars that have come into my lab over the year have come from Department of Defense. It's intellectually untenable to say, as some researchers might that, oh, well, we'll take the defense dollars, but we're not going to collaborate with the defense industry or the military. It's just intellectually untenable. Well, how do you get that done? The students are very, very concerned about how to do this, and so that particular town hall emphasized how do faculty think about managing their research portfolios in this relationship. But we've also had a series of meetings with private meetings with corporate, with the small advanced robotics industry, let's say, where we tried to sit down with them and with people who have policy background and people from government and military to try to figure out what the best practices would be and at what point we really begin to need regulations or laws, and how would you articulate those laws to make them a little bit less blunt than arguably they have been in the past. So yeah, I would say we're not yet as we're not there yet, I think, but we've been trying very, very hard to work with all of the stakeholders that we can find to sort some of these issues out and do a better job of protecting society.
What about connections to our lawmakers? Has it gone that far? Governor,
working on that. We've had very active collaborations. We've gotten a lot of support from Perry Worldhouse. We've gotten tremendous support from the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law in Annenberg.
The most recent,
we had a very successful.
There was a representative from Congress.
Yeah,
there were, I think, former generals.
Yeah, we had there's a lot of interest in this, obviously, and we have many resources at Penn, many situated in the School of Engineering, and many beyond the borders of the School of Engineering. And we're, as Mark has said, the students are extremely exercised by this and really want to see some leadership. And we owe it to the society that's funded our work to try to help sort through the combination of technical and social issues that make these so complicated.
No, this is great. I'm so happy to hear about these. Michael?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I might add is just, again, speaking as somebody more from the tech, AI, machine learning side of things, is that, first of all, I think it's extremely difficult to anticipate and therefore to prevent in advance harmful uses of technology, because often before you realize that possibility is there, it is too late. I have a friend who's a venture capitalist who's famous for a quote, which I'll paraphrase, which is, the next big thing always looks like a stupid toy when it first comes out. And the internet is a good example of that. I think many people's reaction to the internet at the beginning was like, why would I want this? Why would I want my own web page? I mean, some people saw it, but many people, including myself, didn't really think it was such a big deal. We already knew how to transfer files across the internet. Why is it a big deal that ordinary people can now communicate with each other and have their own presence on the internet, et cetera? And, and then we started to have things like social networks. And again, when Facebook first came out, I think many kind of adults' perception of it was like, what a waste of time. Why would I want to do this? And then, of course, at some later point, you have platforms like Twitter. And now it's a big deal. And again, going back to my comment before about sort of separation of responsibility, it's a very pervasive thing in the tech industry to ask the question, who's to blame for election manipulation on social media platforms? Is it the creators of the platform in the first place? Is it the users that made it grow and monetized it? Or is it the bad actors that kind of came in at the last second and manipulated the users of that platform? And so I think I am not bullish on kind of anticipating these things in advance, because the very word innovation suggests to me some amount of serendipity and unpredictability in, and again, kind of getting back to my critique of the computer science community, that so often something gets built just because it has become possible to do so and it seems cool to someone. So, I mean, other than like classes like the one that I and others teach, I think the most thing that's important is making people think carefully about their choices as early as possible. And so I'll give one concrete example of something that I think is a good trend. And this would have been unthinkable, I think, 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago. All of the major machine learning and AI conferences now require an explicit ethics statement in all submissions of papers to those conferences, in which basically you're asked to honestly assess potential consequences of your technology downstream from what you've done, okay? And, most of the papers say something, that it's not that controversial what they're doing, or at least, no reasonable person can imagine why this would be a problem at the time. And so they kind of say that. But it's forcing people to think about it. In a similar vein, there have been proposals, none of them adopted yet, that every paper in the AI community that's submitted to major conferences or journal should have an estimate of the carbon footprint of the compute cost to train the model described in the paper. And this is a harder thing because now you're making something that was qualitative. You're trying to make it quantitative now, and there's disagreements on how you measure these things. And of course, how do you measure the literal costs that you put into training the model in terms of carbon footprint versus perhaps savings, that you will create downstream. But these are just examples of making people think explicitly about these questions early and often. It's not going to prevent a lot of things, but I think it will at least make people collectively more thoughtful. And I think that's about all you can do.
Is there anything like that going on in the robotics community?
There are efforts to include social impacts in papers. They're spotty. What I might add to what Michael is saying is that there's an unfortunate trend that's always been there, but it's more pronounced now, to get stuff out. Even people who are thoughtful about impacts are under great pressure, particularly in the industry, but even in research laboratories and in academia, under tremendous pressure to get stuff out that's cool. And, these shiny new tools are extraordinarily powerful, very, very interesting. The worry that I have is that increasingly we're putting things out that we don't understand, that nobody really understands. And it's not that we can't understand them, but it would take more time than is permitted or than is allowable in young people's careers, let's say early careers, some of the people who are pushing these things. And so I think even before we start imposing expectations about the unpredictable social implications of what we're doing, which is extremely valuable and important, we should do a better job of accounting for the limitations of our work, being very, very careful to list the assumptions that are being made. The tradition had been for a very long time that there would be some kind of a mathematical analysis, and there would be, of course, assumptions made to have the analysis be valid, and those assumptions told you something about the limitations of your work. Those traditions have been eroded greatly in the last decade, I would say decade and a half. So at the same time that we're putting these very, very exciting things into the world, we're being less cautious than we could be and should be about understanding the things that we put out. And I think this is not just robotics. It's particularly true in robotics, but it's also very true I would say it's particularly true in the AI world right now. And I think it's extremely problematic.
Yeah, I think the core issue is, I agree with everything that they're saying. Everyone's saying but one of the core issues is we have to weigh the value of whatever we're doing versus the potential harm, like even the mere
right, Marie Curie.
Right, there's all kinds of
nuclear medicine and X-ray machines are important.
Right, and all the energy, all this kind of stuff is there's value to it, and there's also the harm, and so we have to be able to predict the potential value and the potential harm and weigh the two. Just because there is some harm doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but the predictability is the thing
this is the issue that we don't understand. Too often we're putting things out that we don't understand that are very, very powerful, and we don't understand them.
These days, and I think the most current thing is, there's this machine learning black box, which people are starting to try and understand, like, how can we validate what's going on inside there? But maybe we need more effort in that as well.
At least the physicists understood, had good physical and mathematical models to undergird the things that they were building. The things that we're building, which prove to be maybe not as quickly, but equally capable of burning down the house. We could have, as Mark and Michael are saying, it's not like we couldn't understand them. We could. It just would take more effort and more time. And the burden on the community should be greater to make sure that we're putting that effort into understanding them either formally or empirically, so that at least we can express the limitations with some degree of care and accuracy.
What are we doing here at Penn to ensure the safety of what we're doing?
Well, I want to say that the people that you have on this panel have a history of being responsible. You know, Michael Kearns is legendary in his field for doing careful, formal analysis of the very exciting work that he's doing. Mark Yim has a long, long tradition of invoking extremely careful connections to physics and the physical thinking and physical justifications for the systems that he's built. Many of the faculty in the School of Engineering, across all the departments, but particularly in these robotics-facing, computer science, AI-facing areas, have a long, long history and tradition of taking trying to take a very formal or physical, empirical foundation point of view in the work that they're doing. I believe that I know that we're all still doing that. I think the tradition of doing that has eroded, and it's harder to do it now in the fields that we all work in. But when I look around at my colleagues in the School of Engineering, particularly in areas like robotics or AI, I'm extremely impressed and encouraged that we have such strong commitment to that formal and rigorous thinking.
So let me backtrack a little bit to Michael's formal. How do we formally justify what our algorithms are doing? And I think that even in the areas of privacy, for example, differential privacy, people have come up with very good formal definitions. You can quantitatively evaluate the privacy protection of certain algorithms, and yet when they actually get deployed, they don't always help for the purposes for which they're now being used. So they were evaluated in one sort of world, but then the world in which they're being used is different, and so it becomes an issue.
Yeah, I mean, let's see, a couple of thoughts here. So one, in terms of kind of rigorous formal analyses of technology and algorithms, I agree with Dan. I mean, this is what I do. This is what I enjoy. I think it's important. I think it's intellectually satisfying and interesting. But in order to make such analyses, as Dan has already suggested in his earlier comments, you make these rigorous assumptions about sort of the conditions under which you're going to do the analysis, and then you proceed to do so. And then a lot of times in the wild, those assumptions are violated, or there's some, other threat that you didn't think about. And cryptography is a good example of a type of technology whose history is littered with these problems. We have, from a mathematical algorithmic standpoint, we have the strongest kinds of formal guarantees that you could want from cryptographic protocols at all, under the conditions that they were analyzed. But then, you put them out in the wild and people think of all kinds of so-called side channel attacks and other ways of attacking them. And areas like privacy are, very adjacent to cryptography and are vulnerable to the same kinds of problems. But I don't, maybe disagree slightly with Dan that kind of the loss of a tradition of rigorous analysis and sort of, kind of careful math are the real problem. I think money is a big problem. And
I thought he was going to say complexity, but money is an interesting one.
I think money is a problem because
incentives line up a certain.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, my field of machine learning has changed radically in the now approaching 40 years. So when I first started machine learning, it was kind of an obscure corner of the then discredited larger field of AI. And its main problem was this lack of rigor, this sort of lack of mathematical analysis of algorithms and models, and more importantly, sort of an empirical inability to make comparisons. So in the early machine learning conferences, one speaker would get up and say, oh, I wrote a program that does this, and here are some cool examples of it, working. And then somebody else would get up and say, like, well, I built a system that does something completely different than the last speaker, and here are some cool examples. This is very anecdotal, and now we kind of have the opposite problem in machine learning, which is there's so much money flowing into it, and it's become a standalone, very large industry with huge investment in it. And so now the field of machine learning research, as a consequence, has become quite like a competitive sport. So you have these benchmark, the ability to make comparisons is no longer the problem. You have these benchmark data sets that everybody agrees on. You have the CFAR data set for computer vision and object detection and labeling and things like this. And it's basically a requirement that if you're writing a paper on that topic, that you report your results on these benchmark data sets. And so it literally is like a competitive sport. There are, leaderboards, there are best error rates on these data sets. And this is kind of a piece with, and so I don't think these problems are really Penn-centric. I mean, we can do everything we can locally to address them, and I think we've talked about those efforts already here. But we're at some point, our students and our faculty go out into the world, and then you're swimming in this world that is awash with investment and the pressures that those investment brings. And just to be clear here, I'm agnostic on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. There have been huge benefits to AI and machine learning. It's a very interesting field. I think it has great promise. But I think the real problem is that the science, it's not so much the mathematical rigor, it's just maybe the patience that Dan was talking about, to wait until you understand technology better, instead of like, oh, well, we don't quite understand it, but there's this other research group or startup or large company that if we don't get ours out there quickly, they're going to get theirs out there first. And then, we won't have a paper at this conference, or, we won't get venture capital funding and like. And it really has a strong trickle-down effect, I think, on the way people think about their research and engage in their research. And so I think this is kind of the challenge we face.
But also sort of the metrics for evaluation that we impose on junior faculty, sort of the number of papers that also adds into it.
Yeah, agreed.
So what do you think will be the biggest challenges for innovation in the next decade?
Innovation in general, or responsible innovation?
Well, that's interesting.
Because responsible innovation, I think it's the things that Michael just said about, can we come up with ways that more at a meta level help to change the incentives, get people to think and care a little bit more. Well, they care about how can we give them time so that they can actually evaluate the downsides and actually understand the downsides, as opposed to just focusing on, oh, it does this one thing. What about the other things, the side effects? And that's super hard. It's not, I think people are starting to think about that and try to figure out ways, but it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real challenges are the ones we've talked about before, and especially kind of the non-technical ones, which is how do you allocate responsibility in sort of very, very complex technological environments where, one of the crowning triumphs of computer science as a field is modularity. The fact that I can sort of build a piece of technology that does something, and you can adapt that for some completely different purpose, because all you need to know is kind of the input-output behavior of the technology that I built. And that is an incredibly powerful tool, because it means that, that people can easily build on the technology that other people have provided. But it also makes, anticipating unintended consequences very, very difficult. And it also makes allocating responsibility, or in the case where something bad has happened, blame, very, very difficult. And so I think a lot of my anticipation is that technology and science will continue trundling forward. They have some of the challenges and problems that I mentioned about, sort of the rush to, get stuff out there as quickly as possible. But I think the real, kind of the important area over the next decade or so is how the regulatory and legal framework shapes up, and how long it takes those communities to get to the point where they have sort of a more granular view of the underlying technology and how it's built. And also, you know, I mean, these are ancient debates that have gone on in so many other areas before, but, you know, there's a question of whether, for instance, the AI industry can self-regulate more effectively than maybe it has so far. And so I think, even though we're kind of talking about technological innovation here, I think there's got to be a lot of kind of social and regulatory and policy innovation, and that's maybe the most important topic going forward.
I mean, we've said, I think we've said the same thing in different ways, and I think we seem to all have the same feeling that the impetus to be involved in the community has been weak in the past, and it's strengthening, but perhaps not. I mean, the model that Mark is describing, where the community begins to drive or at least be influential in the creation of the problems, is extremely healthy, but it requires a two-way interaction between the technical community and the social community, so that there's a lot of work to be done on both sides, you know, in all parts of academia and society, wherein people need to begin to engage much more than they have with some of the technical issues. We must do a better job of communicating what those technical issues are, because the real burden, or the real effort that's required over the next decade or so, is to think through as soon as possible the social implications. Very, very hard to do, and impossible to do just from a technological standpoint. Equally impossible to do just from a social, scientific, or legal, or ethical framework. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done here. My colleagues are some of the leaders in getting that work done, and I think Penn Engineering is working hard and increasingly so to try to advance that agenda.
I think one of the points that you brought out earlier of kind of, as Dana's saying, getting different types of people together from these different disciplines as one way to address these challenges, make sure that we have all these different viewpoints together.
So, you know, going back to your comments on influencing policy, and so many of our lawmakers are not technologically sophisticated. So much of our legal system is not technologically sophisticated. And what can we do to help improve that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a big topic. You know, I think my short answer to your question is that I believe that over time, and I think it will take a lot of time, algorithmic regulation needs to look more algorithmic. So the way a lot of our laws are written, they basically, you know, like take something like contract law, which is already incredibly complicated, or any kind of body of law. You know, contracts, you know, when anybody with experience reading detailed contracts know that, oh my God, you know, why is this agreement, you know, 250 pages long? Well, it's trying to anticipate a lot of cases, but still a lot, there's a huge reliance on the court system, right? So it's kind of understood that you don't need to spell out absolutely every single detail or possible scenario or corner case, that, you know, you kind of have you write enough detail that you know what the spirit of the law is. And then for the ambiguous cases, you count on the court system and judges and juries to sort of lay down case law on specific, you know, instances when they arise. So that kind of doesn't cut it when it comes to algorithmic regulation, I think, because, you know, first of all, anything can happen in technology, because, you know, you give a computer program an input, it's going to give you some output. And so I think we need to figure out some way of crafting laws and regulation that are a little bit more technical in their specifications, actually, and might look a little bit more like code than, you know, than straight up, you know, English, for example. One other comment I'll make is that in my industry wanderings, which have involved a lot of interaction with, you know, legal, public policy, and regulatory people, you know, of course, I mean, everybody I think would agree that in order to kind of get to the point where we have more effective laws and regulation, or even self-regulation of the industry, there needs to be more interaction between the people that know the technology and build it and lawmakers. And one of the things that's very hard about that is that a lot of times it's, it seems like nonsensical and or incredibly tedious work. So I can't tell you how many times I've been, interacting with people in a public policy or regulatory setting, and the first thing they want to do is they say like, let's give a definition in English of machine learning. Yeah. Okay. And I'll admit, I see where they're coming from. I see why you want to start there, but I'm just like, oh, what a terrible, terrible idea. What a horrible, tedious exercise. But they're going to do it anyway, right? And so if people like me won't get involved in that, then they're going to do it anyway, and then we're not going to like it, and it'll, And so I think part of the hurdle to overcome is not just regulatory, regulators and public policy being willing to put the effort in to learn more about the science and the technology. It's the science and technologists being willing to do work that they find unpleasant, boring, nonsensical for some amount of time. And that's hard. That's hard to get people to do.
Mark has a reaction here.
Well, so one of the interesting things is, I don't know if this is a trend, but I just had a PhD student, Walker is an excellent student. His goal in life, or at least for after getting his PhD, was technology policy, which is, and if that's a trend, that would be really great for, Penn, or for students to have people that realize this is an issue and want to help address it.
So, we by the way, not only is it a trend, there are some great people in the law school at Penn. So there's Christopher Yu, there's Kerry Coglianese, there's Tom Baker. These people, they understand quite a bit about the underlying technology and the law, and so they're great examples.
So
we need more people like them.
Of course, these are very, very important engagements. What also I think has become clearer to us as a society in the last 10 years is that there's some. It's a very big topic. There's a departure from facts, and there's a departure from interest or capability of facts. And we've always had in the engineering school, we've always had a very strong outreach effort where we try and go out and work in the community and educate and communicate. But it's particularly incumbent upon us now to convince people that actually there are facts. Actually, there are things that you can learn, and there are things that are true, and there are ways of approaching what's true, and there are ways of trying to due diligence on the authority with which your reading informs you of something. I would say it's a huge topic that even goes beyond our willing. Yes, we have to do more to translate our work into terms that the engaged policymakers and thinkers can work on with us, but we apparently haven't done a good enough job of getting people to understand the basis of the science that surrounds them. It's either magic or unreal. So it's that we need to do more of that too.
So we have the lawmakers or people who we hope will get a little bit more technologically savvy, and then we've got the technologists who will hopefully be able to engage.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking that if we can get people to be in the middle, people like Walker, who was, he got his PhD in robotics and understanding that stuff, but wanted to apply to technology policy, or if we get, people that are on the political side or the policy side that have much more learning inherently on the technology side, then it won't be painful.
So I also have a student who's an undergraduate. He's a senior this year, who's been my TA for my course for several years. Very strong, very involved in Penn App. So he understands technology very well. He wants to be a White House intern next semester, and he applied for that. And I thought, this is wonderful, to have that type of, engagement or interest in a young student. It's wonderful.
And actually, I was thinking that was one of the things we could do as professors when we get students. We talk, usually when students come in and they want to get a PhD, they want to have impact on the world. And if we can tell them, one of the ways you can have huge impact is policy. Technology policy especially these days. You can have real impact on the world.
Right. And I know there are opportunities for faculty to become fellows. I can't remember the technical term at part of the White House.
Yeah, I mean, we have
Margaret Martinozzi at Princeton University was there for several.
We have a great, our dean spent a number of years in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So again, I'm very impressed with many of the efforts that my colleagues have put out. Not that we're not doing work in these areas, but clearly we're not doing enough. These conversations need to be more frequent and go further, as my colleagues are asserting.
Wonderful, wonderful. So just to close, what advice would you give to young innovators or entrepreneurs who want to make a positive impact?
I would say if you want to make a concrete positive impact for young innovators, start locally. You can do something to your community or your neighbors. You can do something good for people, and not only think about, don't do what's easiest, but try to find people that need the most help and make the largest impact that way, in a concrete way.
Yeah, I mean, for researchers, it seems the clear need is to spend much more time studying the humanities and becoming intellectually diverse at the same time as one seeks a community of research.
Coming from the background of being an English major.
Yes, okay. Perhaps it's a little bit parochial for me to say this, but it's just the social world is so complicated, and it's so different than the technical world in some of the ways in which one thinks about facts or thinks about comparisons or limitations, that I think we need much more of that training on the one hand. So there's intellectual diversity that I would urge upon any entrepreneur. But, then clearly what we've seen time and again in our laboratories and in the spin-off companies is that the more diversity of identities that you have in your group, the greater the international influence, the greater the demographic variation across the group, the better the work will be. And then finally, I can't, my wife is a professor of nursing, and she continually berates me for not doing the kind of thing that Mark has been pioneering, which is to actually go out into the community and try to engage with the potential users of the things that you're thinking that you might like to build. More of us need to do that, particularly on the entrepreneurial side. So, yeah.
And then maybe since both of them, I think, kind of suggested things that, young entrepreneurs can do that are kind of more local, like, go get involved with a specific group of people in a community. I'll give a more general answer, which is, I think, at least in the areas that I work in, and this is really just kind of summarizing some of the things that have been said already. I think it's really important to know what you can control and try to do so when you can, and then also know about the things that you can't control and what the consequences of those might be. So, for example, when the famous book Weapons of Math Destruction came out and sort of pointed out all of the instances in which there was demonstrable demographic bias resulting from training machine learning models, that was a very influential and very good book, but it didn't suggest that one could avoid that problem in the first place if you just trained your model slightly differently than you normally would. And so this was sort of part of the motivation for Aaron and I to write the ethical algorithm, is to tell people like, we didn't literally say this, but remember the problems from that other book? There are, in some cases, things you could have done to avoid that in the first place. And so I think, and I think the AI and machine learning community has done well in this regard in the last 10 years. And in that, I think I'd be quite surprised to find any kind of card-carrying ML researcher who wasn't aware that there are ways of avoiding demographic bias and privacy leaks, because there's a large literature on this topic now. But for undergraduates who are thinking about going out and working in industry, they might be able to get through an AI or a computer science major and not be aware that that's something you can prevent. And so I think it's very important to educate our students and for them to educate themselves on kind of what are the things that can go wrong and which are the ones I can control, and then to think hard and admit the ones that they don't know how to control.
So I think that your course is wonderful, but it only accepts so many students. And the trend that I've seen in some of our computer science courses, in particular big data analytics, which is the capstone course for data science, we try to infuse the ethical questions at each sort of module or thought thing in the course. So there's like 5 pausing points where we'll say, think about this issue with respect to what we just taught you. And having taught that course, I can tell you our students are really interested in interacting over those ideas. So personally, I think we need to be infusing these questions into all of our courses so that they don't graduate not having at least had to think about it. I want to thank you all so much for spending this time with me and for the wonderful insights that you have provided. I'm certain that our listeners have gained a lot throughout this discussion. And I want to thank our audience for joining us at Penn Engineering's Innovation and Impact podcast on responsible innovation. Please subscribe to Penn Engineering's Innovation and Impact podcast series on your favorite podcast platform, and you can watch a video of this recording on Penn Engineering's YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.